I'm Rebecca Moss and I head up digital PR at Jbh in Manchester. I've been doing outreach in one form or another for around 10 years and it's definitely my favourite part of SEO. But the data-led side of things didn't always come that easily to me, which is why I had to develop this framework to help me make data my secret weapon when it comes to link building. So let's dive in. Data-led digital PR campaigns are my bread and butter. They are my comfort zone. Because for me, data-led campaigns mean more links. I can build more links on average with a data-led campaign than I can with any design-led campaign, and that's just the way it goes. But I am by no means a data scientist or a maths expert. In fact, I barely passed my maths GCSE, and I'm not even that savvy with a spreadsheet either. So I needed to create a framework to help me, and now you, uncover the magic that lies between those spreadsheets. So by following my 3-step framework, you'll be able to achieve the following. Number 1, you'll be able to extract newsworthy and campaignable stories from any data set that's put in front of you. You'll get more stories out of every single campaign that you run, and you'll be able to pitch more journalists as a result of it. And number 3, you'll be able to present your data-led campaigns in a much more compelling way, which will result in more journalists clicking on your emails and more journalists covering your story. I see so many campaigns being shared that have amazing data behind them. Data analysts in the room, you're doing an amazing job, so shout out to you guys. But when I have a sneaky look at the coverage, come on, we all do it, maybe 1, maybe 2 angles landed out of the whole set. And it goes without saying that we're all so obsessed with finding juicy new data sources. But what we don't hear about as much is what we do with that data once we have hold of it. It really can make or break our campaigns. So how can we start exhausting our data sets without exhausting ourselves? Earlier this year, the Jbh team had a creativity masterclass with Mark Johnston. He said something that really stuck with me, so I asked him if I could share this with you here today at the Online PR Show. Data is only as good as the questions that we ask it. And that point really resonated with me. The data holds all of the stories. We just need to use our storytelling skills to figure them out. In the same way that a journalist will use questions in an interview to get their scoop, we ourselves must interrogate data sets to get our own scoop. So let's let the interrogation begin with 3 key questions. Number 1, what stories do you care about the most? If you only get one story out of this data set, what is the headline, angle and story that will resonate the most? What are the stories that will make your campaign fly? Number 2, what are the 2nd, 3rd and 4th most important things that you want your data to tell you? So you've got your first key story, key angle, but what are the rest of them? Don't stop looking after the first one. Number 3, what juicy stories do you hope that you can unearth from this data? What's going to get that journalist clicking on your email to find out more? We are not data analysts, but what we are is storytellers. And more stories equal less risk when launching a campaign, and that makes our lives much, much easier. So let's imagine we already have our data set and you're sat there looking at a spreadsheet full of numbers thinking, where do I begin? Where do I start? We know what kind of headlines we want to achieve. We know what publications we want our campaigns to land in, but how do we get to that point? How do we get those stories? And by the way, it's okay to feel overwhelmed at this point. I often do, but my framework will help you organise your thoughts and extract those juicy stories in a much easier way than you might imagine. So multipliers, they're the first step of the framework, and it's the first thing that I turn to when I'm looking for insights in a raw data set. You'll see journalists use them all of the time, but you might not actually notice it, as they're a technique that help audiences and readers make sense of statistics. And per capita is probably the most common one, and it really is just a fancy Latin way of saying per person. So let's say you're working on a campaign which is looking at the cities in Europe that have the most green space. It's highly likely that London is going to come out on top of that campaign. It's going to be first in the index ranking, however you're going to do it. But that, to me, is not surprising. We know London's a green city. We know London's got loads of parks. Would you talk about that with your friends down the pub? Probably not. So for that reason, this story doesn't really pass the so what test. But all is not lost. You can get a brand new story by using the multiplier technique. So what you would do, that's what I would do, is divide the total amount of green space by the number of people sharing that space, and that will give you a whole new story. So for this example, Paris comes out on top. Paris is the greenest city in Europe was the headline that Vanity Fair went with. This is probably my most used way to get another story from a basically dead data set. But there are other ways that you can use multipliers, and they can also help resurrect a dead data set. We launched a campaign earlier this year, which looked at the best countries around the world to start a business, and that was based on the availability of government grants and funding. I hoped in my heart that somewhere really quirky would come out on top. But it was not to be. It was the US that came out on top. It didn't really pass my so what test. It was a bit boring. We've heard this story before. But knowing what we know from the European Cities campaign, how can we use the multiplier technique to make this data feel more compelling? How can we extract more stories from this data set that someone spent a lot of time putting together for us? How can we get more out of it? So I'm going to show you what we did to kind of rescue this campaign. We went back into our data and we asked it some more questions. We divided the number of startup businesses by the number of established businesses to find out which country had the highest ratio of startups overall. That was a new story, something that we hadn't seen before. And also it gave us something really interesting to talk about. Canada was the top of the pops, top of the ranking, along with a whole new pool of journalists for us to pitch to. So that was fantastic. That really kind of resonated with the journalists there, and it did really well. You can even have a little bit of fun with multipliers. So last year, our online estate agent client decided they wanted to put Buckingham Palace up for sale. They'd valued the iconic landmark at about £4.9 billion. But this isn't a new story. I try to tell the client this. I was trying to say, this isn't a new story. We see this story every year. But then I thought, actually, hang on. There are some techniques that we can use with this valuation that the estate agent has actually put together for us, that we can make it into a brand new story. So by using the multiplier technique, we were able to refresh this story. We were able to come out with something totally brand new that we hadn't seen before. So number one, we looked at what percentage of public sector debt could be repaid by selling off Buckingham Palace. And this was super timely because everyone was talking about coronavirus debt and kind of how long we'd be paying that off for. And then we looked at how much of the royal family finances could be repaid through the sale of the palace. And that again was really newsworthy and timely. And we saved that pitch for when we knew that the royal family accounts were going to be released. And it led to headlines just like this. So eMove lists Buckingham Palace at £4.9 billion to ease that royal finance burden. And it's time to put Buckingham Palace up for sale. And how much could it wipe off the UK's debt? But we didn't just look at Buckingham Palace. We valued the homes of 20 more world leaders in the same way. And then we used the multiplier to work out which world leader could afford to buy their home outright. All I did here was use that same property valuation from our estate agent, and I divided it by the individual world leader net worth. And that gave me a whole new story, which led to headlines just like this. So which world leaders could afford to buy their famous residences? And meet the 6 world leaders who could afford to pay for the stately homes they live in for free. Now, it's no secret that lists make for compelling reading. So top 10 for this, bottom 10 for that. But we have to be so careful when we're doing top and bottom ranking lists. And I need to give you a word of caution really with this. Whenever you present a top 10, there will always be a bottom 10. And that can lead to headlines just like the ones you see in front of you now. You can end up with an unhappy client, and you can end up with an unhappy PR team, an unhappy journalist actually. So be really careful with what you share, who you share it with, and how you share it. But that's a topic for another day. Comparisons and groupings. So let's move on to the next step of the framework. Journalists will often use comparisons in their stories to help readers understand a stat, particularly when it's a larger stat which is much harder to visualise. Can you imagine what 429,000 tonnes of greenhouse gas looks like? I don't think I could. So let's compare that figure to something that we can all relate to. So last November, we ran a campaign which predicted the amount of carbon emissions to be released into the atmosphere due to our love for online shopping around Black Friday. The data was great, it was timely, it was shocking, it was newsworthy. It was all the things that we love in a digital PR campaign. But what was really important was getting that messaging right. And it was going to be tricky actually because the stat was so big. So what we did was we used the comparison technique. We worked out what 429,000 tonnes of carbon emissions would look like, both in return flights between London and New York, and also the same weight in elephants. Forbes loved it, the BBC loved it, and both publications used our comparisons and groupings to make sense of the statistics. We see comparisons all of the time. For example, there's one here, comparing deforestation to the size of football pitches and comparing the amount of tea drunk in the UK to Olympic swimming pools. It's because it's something that we can all relate to. So it's a really great technique to use if you're working with big numbers and are struggling to make them fit kind of in your pictures or in your subject lines. Spin is the third and final part of the framework, and it's quite possibly the most fun, but don't be turned off by the word spin. It doesn't have to be negative. You are using your skills to communicate the story in the most effective way. That's all that spin is. So don't let anybody ever tell you otherwise. So let's take this market research data for our client Tails.com. This data was revealing the UK's most pampered poochers. If we take the data at face value, so say what you see, this is what we get. Dogs owned by women get 41% of the treats in a household. Dogs owned by men get 44% of treats in a household. So therefore, men are a bit more generous than women when it comes to the giving out the treats. It's kind of interesting. I guess we could get a bit of coverage out of it. It would probably land in a couple of choice publications. But I bet we can have a look at this data and see how we can slice and dice it a little bit more. So that's exactly what we did. So I decided that the angle that I wanted to go with was, it's me or the dog. So we're tapping into that well-known rivalry between couples and their pets. So how often do women treat their dogs versus treating their partners? That was the story that I wanted to get out of it. We can see here that women are 3 times more likely to buy treats for their dog than treats for their partners. Now this is interesting, this is more compelling. I can already see the headlines, and this is the story that actually landed the best. As you can see here, so Scottish dog lovers would rather treat their pets than their kids and their partners. Wow. And it's worth saying actually that this isn't just reserved for market research surveys. You can do this technique with any data set that's been collected, any government data, anything you like. You can use all these techniques that we're talking about today to be able to get more stories from that piece of information. So over at JBH, we have a dedicated channel on Slack, and this is where we test our headlines. We use the reactions and kind of vote for the ones we find the most interesting. So I thought I'd test a couple of headlines on them, basically to prove a point. So option A, 15% of families in the UK order takeaway every weeknight. Option B, 1 in 6 UK families order a takeaway 5 times a week. One of these headlines got loads more reactions than the other one. And it was option B that they all liked the most. And there's actually a reason for that. 9 times out of 10, a journalist won't use a percentage in a headline. They won't use a raw percentage anyway. And that's because there are much more compelling ways to express percentages. So there's an example here that I found in the press the other day. And it's a really good example actually because it shows the difference between the headline and the body copy. So as you can see here, the headline is environmental sustainability is top priority for 1 in 5 consumers. So they use 1 in 5 in the headline, and then in the body copy, they go on to reveal the full percentage, which is 18%. 1 in 5 and 18% are basically the same thing, but one sounds much more interesting and much more compelling than the other. And this is why journalists use it in their headline. 1 person out of every 5 or 18%. I know which one I'd find more interesting as a reader. Now, I said at the start of this talk that you don't have to be a maths whiz to be able to do any of this. And I'm true to my word, you totally don't. So today, I'm launching the Jbh Pr Percentage Calculator here at the online PR show. The calculator is a collaboration between JBH and Reebly Web Development, and it's here to make your lives easier. All you would do is have your raw percentage, and use the slider on the percentage calculator to work out, to slide it to where you want it to be. And then the PR percentage calculator will show you a variety of different ways to express that percentage in a much more poignant way. So go to jbh.uk/BSEO to try the PR percentage calculator. And please, I would love it if you gave it a share. So that's jbh.uk/BSEO. Using my framework, you'll now be able to squeeze more out of every single campaign that you launch. You can now create pitch calendars that look like this. You'll have stories coming out of your ears basically, and you'll be able to plan your outreach in advance to leave you to get on with the next campaign. And that's exactly how we do it at JBH. You'll pitch more stories and you'll broaden that pool of prospects. You'll have more journalists to speak to and you'll have more stories to tell them about. You'll save yourself time and you'll save yourself headaches. You'll be able to plan your outreach in advance. You'll know what story is going out and when. You'll just have lots more time just because you've planned in advance with all these stories. And as a result of that, your clients will be really, really happy. So moving on to key takeaways. Number 1, mix data sets to create new stories. So slice and dice different parts of the data to create those compelling angles that you didn't even realize was in the data. Interrogate your data sets. So don't just leave it at the obvious angles. Go in there and have a look at all the different parts of the story. Compare different parts of the data to each other. Ask it all of the important questions. What do you really want to know and find out? And number 3, exhaust your data sets and not yourselves. Thank you for listening, and for more digital PR tips and tricks, follow me at BexMoss on Twitter. And also don't forget to try the PR percentage calculator here, so that's jbh.uk/BSEO.